Afternoon, depending on where you are, and thank you for joining today's webinar, the latest updates in the Sage Intacct 2017 releases 4 and 4.1. I'm Megan Turco, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we jump in, I'm going to briefly go over how to use the webinar console. The orange arrow on the right side of your screen will let you toggle the control tray open or closed, and at the bottom of the control tray you'll see a chat window. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time throughout the webinar via the chat function. We will get to those during our Q&A session at the very end of the webinar. Additionally, on your GoToWebinar console, you should see an area for audio settings. If you're calling in through your telephone, please choose the Use Telephone option. And alternatively, if you're using your computer speakers, please select the Use Mic and Speakers option instead. And lastly, I would like to note that today's webinar is being recorded. We'll send out the slides as well as a link to the on-demand recording of the webinar within about 2 days. So if you'd like to check out the webinar content after today, or you'd like to share it with a colleague who couldn't make it with us live, please keep an eye out for that message. And with that, I'd like to introduce today's presenters. First up, we have Manesh Patel, who is a manager on Armanino's Sage Intacct team. Manesh is a certified Sage Intacct implementation consultant with experience working on over 100 Sage Intacct implementations. Additionally, Manesh is knowledgeable in various ERP systems, Concur, Basecamp, and Dropbox. We also have Brenda Kaler with us today. Brenda is also a manager on Armanino's Sage Intacct team. She has over 15 years of accounting experience in Big Four public accounting and in-house as a controller, where she led a Sage Intacct implementation for a 50 million nonprofit operating in over 20 countries. It's great to have you both with us here today, and with that, I'm going to pass the presentation over to Manesh to get us started.
All right, thank you, Megan. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar. It's always nice to be able to see some consistency over the last few quarters in terms of the releases on different applications. So we're going to kind of continue that trend. There's a lot of updates around inventory as well, but here's our agenda. Walking through the contracts update, Salesforce integration. We'll work through projects and order entry. There's a lot of different workflow and other enhancements as well. So we'll be kind of talking you through those and give you as many business cases as possible as we go through this. All right, so we're going to start with the contracts update. So for those of you that have been staying in tune with us over the last 3 or 4 releases, contracts has kind of been the consistent theme all the way through. Various updates that we actually talked about in the last few quarters have been addressed in this quarter or each corresponding quarter. So we're going to kind of talk through some of those pieces, and ideally, you may kind of clear some of your gaps that you've been experiencing. First up is billing and revenue schedules in terms of what is on hold versus resuming revenue schedules. Right now, well, prior to this release, we didn't actually get a chance to separate those. So now Intacct has gone in and made those 2 separate functions. So if I show you this little example here, so this example right here that shows that you can hold a contract line, you see how you can select all those schedules and then place those particular schedules on hold. And then there's another slide here that's going to show you a very similar functionality of putting those or resuming those contract lines. So the only difference between the on hold and resume is you can actually select a resume date and then go ahead and click OK, and that's what helps to separate it. Next up is permissions to generate invoices. So what we found is for those of you or those of our clients that are using the projects module in Intacct, we know that there is a generate invoices button that allows you to invoice all of the projects that are tagged to various transactions, whether they're AP transactions or purchasing or order entry. And very similarly, what we're noticing is a trend between the projects module and the contracts module. So there is actually a generate invoices permissions between contracts as well. The only difference here in terms of what has been added is both a preview and generate. And so the preview is your internal control for a business user or a project manager user to be able to go in and just view what is about to be billed, and the generate is going to be saved for those business users that are actually going to generate invoices. So there's a permission difference, and if you haven't explored this yet, when you're actually going into your roles, you're going to see two different boxes for both the preview and generate. So this is kind of worth looking at those roles again. There's been some updates as well with respect to kind of the automatic bundling of multiple element arrangement contracts. So this is if you've got the contracts module and specifically around advanced revenue management. Typically all the contract lines in a contract will be kind of in the same allocation bundle. Previously you actually had to indicate which of those lines are going to be included in which bundle. So Intacct added this little button here that says default bundle in order for you to assign which of those lines are in that specific bundle. And if you see this example here, let's just say we've got a multiple element arrangement contract with three contract lines. All of the items that are in that default bundle checkbox are actually assigned in that item information page. So now they're going to be all pre-assigned to that same bundle. So nice updates there, kind of just some cleanup. There are various other updates with respect to validations. So prior to this release, those allocations were essentially assigned to the same journal with the same effective date. So now you've got an example where you've got multiple lines and you can bundle lines 1 and 2 in a certain allocation and then lines 3 and 4 in a certain allocation. So various enhancements there that kind of were issues before but now are no longer issues. There has been adjustments to the way that the revenue calculation for straight line specifically is done. So I'm just showing you a little snapshot here of what it was previously. So now, or prior to this, you'd have a total amount on the contract divided by the total number of days. That's your daily allocation rate. You take that and you multiply it by the number of partial periods, and essentially you would get your calculation for straight line revenue. That has changed a little bit. So now you've actually got two scenarios. Basically, you have an extra date scenario. So you've got a last date and a start date for the revenue. So the calculation is a little different. So I just put in a sample here of if I've got a $1,200 contract line with a term of 115 to 114, then as you can see, it's going to take into account what the last period was as well as the initial period. So it's going to multiply those separately. So differences in calculations, probably a little bit more granularity in terms of the update, but that's kind of how it was prior to this, and that's what it is now. And this is just kind of taking that sample calculation further and showing you, hey, how would I actually handle something that was end of the month? So the prior one actually had a little period in between, but this is now end of month. Intacct actually considers the revenue terms that start on the end of the month and the end and end on that end of the month as full periods in between. So you kind of see a little sample calculation here. Probably quite a few decimal points than you might need. All right, and Brenda will talk through what's new in Salesforce integration.
Awesome, thanks Manesh. So kind of in keeping with what we've seen in the last couple of releases, they're continuing to improve the new Salesforce Integration version 2.0. So one of the first improvements we've got here is better tracking and automation on renewals. So this is a really exciting improvement for those of you that are integrating with Salesforce, because what this is going to allow you to do is once you have your renewals template set up, you'll change your configuration to create the opportunity in Salesforce. And what that will allow you to do is kind of automate that creation of those renewal contracts based on a certain set of criteria. You can apply the markup and then track those renewals throughout the system. So this was really brought on as a result of people saying that it was so easy for them to miss renewals in Salesforce because they're the accounting team. So giving the salespeople an opportunity to either create those renewal contracts themselves or to have the system do it automatically is a great improvement here. So the first thing you would do is in Sage Intacct, set the renewal action to create the opportunity in Salesforce. That's what's highlighted in red here. And in Salesforce, you have to enable the renewal opportunities in their configuration in Salesforce as well. There's a little screenshot of that box. You just need to check that box. And then you'll be able to use the template on your contracts to renew. So the nice thing about that is that you've got the options on the side. You can say it's creating it 10 days before the contract ends. You can adjust that. You know, maybe you need 30 days or 60 days before. And you can also do the pricing options. You can keep it the same, and since you can check off what's going to renew on your individual line items. Obviously, you know, your implementation cost or your one-time fees are not going to renew, but you want your subscriptions to continue to renew. That way, you can either keep it the same. You can use a price list using the suggested price. You can do a custom amount. You can enter in an actual dollar amount, or you can do it a markup and markdown, which is probably the most common. You can either do a percentage or a dollar value increase, and in this case you can see on the right hand side there that they've opted to do a 5% percentage markup. So in that case it would renew those lines that were eligible for renewal, increase their cost 5%, and create that template to be imported into Intacct. The awesome thing about it is that you can enable a scheduler. So you can enable a schedule to run daily to sweep all of those new renewal opportunities that meet these criteria, set up your email notifications, and define the default values of the fields that are going to be on those new opportunities. So you can make sure you always have those renewals out on time. So another couple quick updates we had, and this was actually in the 4.1 release. So the Salesforce package was updated to support the growth. So if you have your Salesforce administrator, they may have seen since last Friday, 4.1 came out Friday, you may have noticed that Intacct had an extended maintenance kind of splash page, I guess, as you log in, that they were going to be down last Friday and this Friday to apply some patches and some things, and a whole bunch of 1099 stuff we'll get into at the end. And this was one of the things that they did last Friday. So if your Salesforce administrator has not seen this, they might see it. It's all good. It just means that that upgrade did go through correctly. A couple other kind of small things they fixed. The renewal opportunity stage will default to the value set, and the number of decimals supported has been increased to 4. You won't be able to do any Manesh kind of calculations on there, but at least you can get it out 4 decimal points for that standard cost, because it's very rare that it comes out to a perfectly round number or to just 2 decimals. And they also resolved the too many rows error, which was holding up some of the integrations. Projects, there's only one update for projects this time, but it's a big one, so I thought it was deserving of a section. So kind of running through that. So if any of you are using the projects dimension or the projects module, this field is available for you, and it's the observed percentage complete. So previous to this release, it was one field. So you would go in and you would just overwrite that field every time you needed to update that. Of course, what that means is you lose your historical view of it, especially if you're trying a new product or you've got a new team or something. It's really important to be able to track that completion percentage and see kind of the arc of what your projects look like, because they're very rarely consistently busy throughout the life of the project. So the as of dates are now going to be stored in a table within Intacct, so you have that historical view. So you can look back and see how things progress throughout the life of the project. The other awesome thing about this is, if for those of you using the revenue recognition module, the RevRec templates a lot of times are going to be based on the observed percentage complete. So the as of date is going to correspond to the effective posting date for the revenue schedule. So if you had a milestones where you were recognizing revenue at 33, 66, and 100%, this is going to correspond to those postings. Once you hit that observed percentage, you will recognize the revenue in accordance with your template.
And just adding to Brenda, I actually have some clients that are using this observed percentage completed with the revenue management, And it has been so tough to try to figure out exactly what the prior percentages were without, I mean, the revenue is going to be recognized with whatever the, the spread is remaining on the project, but they were always trying to figure out better visibility in this, and now you actually have that with the date. So
yeah,
totally
it was a huge
update.
problem. Yeah. So the other really great thing is that it's going to create a row within your RevRec schedule and assign the as of date for that row, and that date is going to override everything else. And the nice thing about that is you will not have to go back and revise your RevRec schedules any longer. The observed percentage complete will actually revise those for you. And this is going to be useful in both the project order entry and the project contracts RevRec. So it's applicable to both with their marriage of the projects, contracts, and order entry modules, which is a great lead-in to Manesh for order entry.
Thank you, Brenda. So very similar to the projects, there's just been a few refinements to this module. And I think a lot of our clients that use the order entry, which is an extension to accounts receivable, will find it helpful. If we all recall during any of the implementations that you've done, either with us or another partner, the territory attribute can be assigned to a customer. And really, for reporting purposes, financial reporting specifically, the territory is not exposed, so you can't do any financial reporting off of it. But any kind of customized reporting you could through the custom report wizard. The other use of that territory was specifically when you're printing and emailing documents. You can actually assign the territory to the customer and then send out your invoices via that territory. Well, now there are a few additional filters, so really the territory may not even be needed. Intacct added the customer group filter, so it's just like a dimensional group, just like the other dimensions, and now you can actually send out or print or email invoices based upon that. Also, customer type is exposed, so if you've got customers that are grouped in a certain way by type, then you can group by that. There's a sorting preference by date. So what's interesting, right, is if you're ever using this and you're choosing every invoice that has been posted but not actually sent out yet, I mean, that could be a very big list. So it's kind of difficult to manage that. So it's nice to be able to kind of have it sorted by whatever the actual date is.
And just one comment about this. So the from customer and to customer, some of you may have noticed if you use these filters a lot, that those actually went away with release 4, but they got a lot of feedback of it. So with release 4.1, they are back. So you will now, they thought the customer group was going to solve that problem, but it created a lot of problems for many of the clients. So it was gone, but now it's back. So I think it's a good reminder, just if there are things in the new release that ever cause you some issues, definitely let Intacct know. They are receptive to feedback and they will make adjustments as needed.
Totally agreed with Brenda. Also, another area that was added is a document template. So the results page is actually going to identify whichever document template. Some people don't just have sales invoice in order entry. They might have various types of sales invoices. So it's nice to be able to at least see the name of that. In addition to a few of those functionalities around at least the filtering of the printing and emailing, there's now a print and email button accessible when you edit the sales transaction. It's not just available in the print. So once again, a nice to have that we didn't all think about. So we would all just click view every single time, but it's nice to be able to print it with edit as well. Also, the document template is going to show up in the actual transaction in the history tab. So it's going to display whatever the document template that is associated with that sales transaction. You can associate document templates to individual transaction definitions. You can associate them to customers. You can override them at the time of printing and emailing documents. So there's a lot of ways to keep track of that document template. It's nice to know which one is attached to that invoice. Next up is workflow. Passing back up to Brenda.
So workflow, for those of you that have not been on these webinars before, is kind of Intacct's catch-all bucket for ease of use improvements to make your life easier. So this is my favorite part, and it's usually cross-module. There's usually a couple different updates to workflow in various different sections. So rather than having a separate section for those, they group them all together into the workflow. So the first one we have today is the purchasing approval validations. So if you are an administrator of your system or in charge of the purchasing and creating those approvals and workflows within your system as things change, this is a welcome addition. You can see the warning that's going to be provided up at the top of the screen here. So what Intacct is now doing is, if you set in your purchasing workflow that you want to have an employee manager approval as the first step, if there are any employees who are users in the system that don't have a supervisor or manager assigned on their employee record, it gives you this little warning. Same thing with department and transaction department approvals. It'll look and make sure all the departments have managers. And with transaction location approval, making sure all the locations have managers assigned. So if there isn't one assigned, it's going to give you that checkbox, kind of warning box up at the top with the link. If you click on the blue assign, what it'll take you to is actually a filtered list view that's going to give you all of the employees without managers or all of the departments without managers. So you can go in and then assign them. You can also use this to kind of check your own things. For example, I had a client that had a parent-child relationship in department, and they wanted the parent-child relationship because they wanted to be able to book to the parent, but they didn't want any purchasing transactions to be coded to the parent. They always wanted them to be coded to the child. So we used it we purposely didn't set a manager for the department that they didn't want anybody to use. So if anybody accidentally selected that when they were submitting their purchase requisition, the transaction would fail, and it would tell them there's no department, no manager assigned to that department, pick a different department. So the system would actually enforce that without us having to write a smart rule for it. So that was really nice. The two things to kind of keep in mind here is that the approval policy will be saved even if there are warnings, because they are just a warning. You can tell by the yellow bar on the left-hand side that it's a warning, not a stop event. So it'll still allow you to create that policy, and then what will happen is when those people try to submit a purchase requisition and they don't have a manager assigned, or they're submitting something for a department or a location, then they will hit a full stop. If you've allowed drafts in your system, they can save it as a draft and come back. However, if you do not allow the drafts, in that case they would have to cancel out, lose all the work that they had done, and come back once those had been assigned correctly. So the last call out here is just a quick tip. Make sure that the managers you assign to approve things have permissions to approve purchasing transactions. That's something that's often missed, is you set them up as somebody who is an approver, but they don't actually have the permission to approve something at the correct level if you're talking about a value transaction. Faster mapping in spend management. So this was another area where it was a very manual interface. When you are setting up spend management, which is that add-on to the purchasing module that enforces your budget period and amount, you had to create an GL mapping of all of your items and purchasing to what account and how it was being created. And that there was no way to do that via a template upload. So for those of you that are always changing your items, and for those of us who are implementers, this is a real welcome change to now have that template. The call out here is that this is going to be the second template that is not housed in the import company data on the company menu where all the other templates are. The first template that's not there is your bank reconciliation template. When you're in auto match mode, you get the template from the bank reconciliation screen. And this particular template, if you have spend management enabled, you're going to get that one from the configuration screen for spend management. So you go in there into your configuration screen, click the button to import the mapping, and then you'll see the mapping template right above the date field, and you can click on that and download your template to complete it. On hold and on order auto reversal. So this is an inventory update primarily for the integration with both order entry as well as purchasing if you have inventory transactions going through those. So previously, we've seen a lot of updates to the inventory in terms of now not allowing negative inventory and combining the quantity and the price of the inventory onto one transaction definition. So because that is now included all together, the automatic reversals had previously looked back one level. So if you look at the diagram down the bottom, sales order is converted into the shipper, shipper is converted into the sales voice. So the shipper would look back to the sales order, that's back one level, and it would see that there was an on-hold quantity increase, and it would have no effect because it was an on-hold thing. So instead of going back two levels where there was a quantity there, it would put it out of balance so that your value would not match your quantity. So this is going to help kind of smooth all of that out. So here's a couple examples for both order entry and for purchasing. So if your sales order increases the on-hold quantity and a transaction in the workflow 3 or more levels away decreases the on-hand quantity, you can configure the transaction definition for that transaction. So this will allow you to actually manually correct it as well, similar to the purchase orders. To prevent double counting, the automatic reversal won't be applied if the transaction definitions after the sales order, the purchase order, are manually configured. So this gives you a few examples of how you may need to manually configure these things. And these workflows illustrate when the on-hold or on-order quantities, sorry, that word stuff, are not automatically decreased. So you may have to manually adjust these transaction definitions. Okay, web services enhancements. So a lot of these things are relating to all of the things we discussed as updates in purchasing and contracts in this release as well as in the prior release, that they have now made a lot of those enhancements available through the API calls. So I'm not going to go through these all individually. The two things I am going to touch on are actually down at the bottom there. In general, the API documentation for the legacy functions is now documented. So with the switch over from the developer community over into the Intacct, Sage Intacct community, where everything is now housed, they've brought over everything in there, and it's now available. And then the last thing is support for TLS 1.0 is going to be disabled in March 2018. I believe they said March 16th would be the earliest date. TLS actually stands for Transport Layer Security. It's a protocol that Intacct uses to keep everything secure. 1.1 and 1.2 are already available and are considered to be secure applications. So that is why the TLS 1.0 is going to be disabled so that everybody can upgrade to the secure options, considering this is your financial system. And that is used for both the API access and browser access within the system. All right, inventory.
Yes, inventory. So for those of you that were at the Sage Intacct Advantage Conference, inventory is going to be a big focus over the next few quarters. And we're starting to see, at least in this latest release, just clearing a lot of gaps where there were holes that have been present, and Intacct is now going in and making some of those various updates. So stay tuned over the next few releases. This slide looks pretty simple, but there is a ton to this slide that is actually new, so I'm going to kind of walk you through it. But essentially, inventory cost is always an area where clients are trying to get better visibility on whether the costs are actually correct, or if costs need to be recalculated, how do you actually do that in the right way? And so inventory valuation has always been an area where people either had to make manual adjustments or they just didn't have the right insight into what was correct and not correct. So when you actually recalculate the inventory costs, Sage Intacct runs a process. It's going to pull all of the relevant transactions that are affecting inventory. So Brenda just walked through how purchasing affects inventory, how both the quantity and value, how sales affects inventory. Right on the purchasing side, we are increasing our inventory, and on the sales side, we're decreasing and recording the COGS. So this recalculation actually generates a CSV file that will highlight all the different points that are different than the original recorded cost. And so this functionality has taken kind of a upward swing in terms of what's new. So now, prior to this release, only the inventory items that went through this recalculation process, it only supported the average cost method. Well, that's not great, right? It didn't support all the cost methods. So Intacct added all of the cost methods as available to support this recalculation. They also added the item group. They've also gone in and added a recalculate from date. So actually, they removed the recalculate from date. So prior to this release, it's always been a problem. Well, if I acquired a item that was originally last year, but this recalculation is from only this year, it's really not going to be an accurate picture. So they removed that, and now it's always going to recalculate the inventory cost from the date of the very first transaction. So various updates around that. And just good to be able to kind of see a little bit more visibility on what's happening with cost. Intacct also, as a part of this recalculation feature, added some scheduling. So after you've brought all your costs up to date, you can go in on a regular basis and perform those recalculations. And if you're using the Audit Trail in any other area in Intacct, the Audit Trail is going to keep track of when you ran this recalc, who ran it, and when they ran it. So it's just going to give you a little bit more visibility that maybe was not there prior, but is now there moving forward. Best practice, how do we keep our inventory costs in really good shape? Well, here's kind of the three-step plan where you're going to use the recalculate the costs functionality and hit the analyze option. Analyze is going to do what I had mentioned around pulling out that CSV template to show you everything that differed from the original transaction, anything that's misconfigured transaction definition-wise, and allow you to run that analysis and then go in and have an update option. So it's going to be available to update, and then you can run that analysis again and make sure that it's correct. And then you can go out and schedule this to be calculated on a recurring basis. One quick call out on those transaction definitions. It's really easy to misconfigure your transaction definitions with respect to inventory. There's a lot of them, especially when we set it up out of the box, and then our clients are going in and just duplicating and adding ones here and there. I actually have seen clients that have added new transaction definitions, but they forgot to put in the account mapping. So they were just adding all these inventory adjustments, but they didn't know, or they had found out that they weren't actually posting to the GL. Obviously a huge issue. So Intacct added in those transaction definitions, they actually added a general ledger button and then a don't post button. So now you know which of those definitions are going to actually post to the GL versus not post to the GL. This was a theme, warehouse transfers between locations in different entities was available in the last release. Now they've gone in and made it available for multiple entities in a multi-entity shared environment with multiple base currencies. So after you essentially save this information, it's going to go in and allow you, this base currency was just added, but it's going to be the base currency of that U.S. entity. So U.S. California is USD. And then you're going to see that exchange rate show up, and what are you going to actually transfer it as? So some extra fields there that are included. And then I've got an example in here that at least shows you what's happening on the debits and credit side. So assuming that we've got some, looks like 10 units of a particular item at a cost of $100 each, and you're going to go in and transfer from our entity in the US to a warehouse in India. The USD to INR exchange rate on the specific exchange rate date is $65.30. And so you can see what the debits and credits are, how you're obviously going to affect the intercompany on both sets of entities. So nice to be able to see this functionality between, just kind of making a little bit more functionality around warehouse transfers, or make it easier without doing separate journal entries to capture that. Kit costing report. This is also one actually that was introduced in the prior quarter and they cleaned it up, but great resource to look at. Hey, what's happening for any of the items that I'm pulling together and calling it a kit? What do I want to pull? As you can see in this particular report, I'm grouping by warehouse, And then I'm also grouping by document, by transaction number as well. So you can see exactly what's happening to these kits, whether they're ins, outs, both on the order entry and purchasing side. So lots of various updates there around inventory. Stay tuned. There's going to be a lot more that Sage Intacct is coming out with respect to inventory.
All right. Other enhancements. This is where Intacct puts all of the little things that are small, little updates, but may or may not have a big impact on your workflow. So first one, administration improvements. They are continuing to make improvements to the audit trail. So the audit trail was unveiled by Intacct, I believe, R1, or was it? Mm-hmm. Early last year, either R1 or 2. And they've been continuing to build it out ever since. So they released it. So one of the things I think the big call out there is that the audit trail does not actually track everything. So I do encourage you to actually check it out on the various objects and see what it does track so that you know what's being tracked and what's not by the audit trail. And if there are things that you do want to be tracked, please submit support cases, let us know. We can give that feedback to Intacct to make sure that they are tracking the things that are important to you. So as we're gearing up for audit season, for a lot of people with calendar year ends, you can now export the audit trail report to PDF format. As a recovering auditor myself, I love this option because you can be sure that it wasn't modified by anybody in the interim, and you can actually email it right to your auditors directly from the system. So kind of that chain of custody is really clear. And you can also now view the audit trail for financial reports or graphs from the report center. So anybody who's ever gone in to run a report and run it and realized that somebody has changed all of your account groups around on you, it's good to know who that is so they can undo that if possible. Because a lot of times people don't realize that the account groups affect a lot of things, and it can really, at least it'll give you a place to start with how to get that report fixed back to the way it was. Some other enhancements we have, closing the books faster. If you have a lot of entities, I would say probably more than 20 entities, it could sometimes take a long time if you were closing all of the books and submodules together. So Intacct had an option for you to do that offline, so you weren't tying up your computer. And then it would send you an email when it was done closing everything. With some dramatic improvements in performance, they no longer have the need to process offline. Closing the books is going to be instantaneous. So they have actually taken away that option from the screen to process offline so that you don't have to wait for that email. It'll be done instantly. So that's a great time saver for those of you with lots of entities. AP Workbench, previously it was giving you some errors when you applied inline credits for cash in multi-book, multi-currency entities. So that was adjusted with this release as well. And they've also added the ability to filter by entity and pay source entity when paying the bills. So those of you, again, in multi-company environments, maybe multiple AP people splitting maybe one company but a lot high volume, you have the ability to do that split. You can also group by entity and the pay source entity as well as doing the filter by it. And lastly, not on this list here, but you can create and save the customized filters. So you can create a particular filter that can be saved and shared. So kind of like you deploy list views, you can deploy pay bills AP Workbench view. So that's pretty awesome. Improved emails from you. In the R3 release, they allowed us to configure Intacct to send invoices, statements, and other emails to customers on behalf of your email domain using the format intacct-mailservice at yourdomain.com. So you can now set up the subdomain to add your email sender key to that instead of to your company's domain, so keeping things a little clean for you. And they've also removed the enforce DNS checkbox. So it will always be enforced as long as you have a domain name in the email sender domain field. So that is great. So print and email invoices with the aging buckets in the invoice currency. So probably a couple years ago now, they unveiled the invoice aging invoice aging on your actual invoice. Instead of having to wait for the statement, you can send your customers what's already outstanding. Part of the problem with that was it could only do it in the base currency of your organization. It could not do it in the currency of the invoice. So now they have made some dramatic improvements there, and it looks like I changed the wording on this, but not the actual text of that. So I'll get that updated before we send these slides out, so that we will have that in the multi-currency. The costing change for inventory items was standard cost. Manesh touched on this a little bit, but previously, if a cost didn't exist for the item and warehouse combination, they used the value in the standard cost field from the item header for the cost of goods sold. So they've now removed that from the header because no currency is associated with the value, and they'll use a zero cost instead. So that's a kind of a bug fix almost, but it was intended functionality. So now they've changed that intended functionality to be more in line with how people are using the system. And the prepaid expense amortization module, the documentation is now available in the Help Center, including setup and workflow. So if you are interested in implementing that module, you can get a little bit more information about what it can do for you and how it can help, and look at kind of the setup costs there. The prepaid expense amortization module allows you to increase your accuracy and save time, because what you're doing is from the purchasing orders and from the AP bills, you can now recognize your prepaid assets directly from there. So it shortens your time because it's going to cut out a step to amortize your prepaids each time. You can also ensure you've got the proper period cutoff for accounting for your expenses in the right periods. So it's a big help there. For the Action UI, they are continuing to make updates to this, which is really helpful. And they've improved the layout, tightened up the vertical spacing. Particularly, this is going to be apparent on the reports page and list pages. They've kind of tightened it up all throughout the interface, but those two particular areas were of concern. The reconciliation pages have returned to coming soon status. They are going to get a facelift, so they will be working on those hopefully for the next release. The Audit Trail is also now converted to the Action UI, so we'll see that coming over as well. And dialog boxes. So previously in Intacct, a lot of those dialog boxes that kind of pop up in various areas there were not able to move, and they were not functioning correctly. So that is now converted. Printing and sending in XML has been adding, so we can now do that, and closing with ease. So please do, if you have not started using the beta UI yet, highly recommend you start that. Intacct is going to be switching everybody over. The nice thing now is that they have rearranged a lot of the menus, so it's going to take a little bit of some adoption time for you to get used to it, and things have changed. So the nice thing now is you can go back and forth between the beta and the live one, but it's one of those things that if you don't know where to find something, you can go find it in the old one, see where you're at, switch into the beta, and then see where it is on the new menu. So we'll be able to have that linkage. Once Intacct has everybody switch over, there won't be that linkage, and you'll have to either open a support case or ask somebody who's been able to find it. So early adopting will give you that chance to kind of have that soft landing and that long runway to get used to the new interface. All right, and this is what everybody was waiting for, I'm sure, is the 1099 enhancements. So Intacct was down on Friday night to load in some of this stuff. This is from release 4.1 as well as my next slide. And these are all really good enhancements. I like these. As a former controller using Intacct, these would have been very helpful for me. So the 1099 flag on manual payments is now going to be editable when you duplicate the transaction. Previously, when you duplicated a manual payment, it duplicated that 1099 flag, but it was grayed out and you couldn't adjust it. So now you can adjust the flag, the box, and the override on that as well. In addition, they've added that flag box and override for purchasing transactions. A lot of times your other employees may not know that something is 1099able, but as a reviewer in the system, you can review that to make sure that before it gets paid, that flag is on it, and hopefully save you a little bit of cleanup at your end or come January. These ones are great as well. The AP adjustments can now be flagged as eligible to be included on the 1099, so you don't have to update those all manually now, and you can reduce somebody's 1099able amount based on how that is flowing through and how that adjustment is applied. And they can now also be pulled into the 1099 report because they have that flag. And they've also clarified the process for automatically updating vendor employee transactions. If you have not ever listened to Intacct's 1099 webinar, they are available in community. They'll be doing another one in January. It's a great webinar to listen to really understand how you can use your templates to mass update transactions, adding or removing that 1099 flag on transactions as well as on vendors. So if you forgot to capture somebody as 1099able back in January, you paid them all throughout the year, you can do everything in a template upload and get all that information on there for you. The last update is also from update 4.1. The final version, or the new final version, I should say, nothing's ever final, and when you're working with a SaaS company, is going to come out in mid-2018. However, they will be doing a small release in release 1 next quarter, and then doing kind of the final push. So a staged rollout for this. So this is just a little preview of what's coming. So those of you using the Intacct Global Consolidations module, you can see here that now it's going to look and feel like the rest of Intacct. Instead of popping out in another window and having all of the bars along the right-hand side, it's now got it across the top. It looks just like everything else. It's easy to see what's been consolidated, so you'll still have that corporation view, that consolidation view, that you can look back for the year and see all of the periods that have been consolidated and when. My favorite thing from this update, which I can't wait to have access to, is the ability to create, edit, duplicate, and delete consolidation books. If you've ever had a consolidation book where you forgot to added a new account and then forgot to add it to your override, or forgot to add it to your eliminations and then consolidated, you have to create a new consolidation book because you weren't able to edit it once the books had been consolidated. So now you will be able to do so. And then my second favorite thing in this is also the ability to schedule consolidations on a set schedule. So if you do want your books to consolidate so you can see how things are shaping up throughout your close, that's going to be a great feature. So in conclusion, we've covered all of the updates in releases 4 and 4.1 related to contracts, Salesforce, projects, order entry, workflow inventory, and then a hodgepodge of other enhancements. Hopefully you found this helpful. Back to you, Megan.
Thanks, Brenda. So we do have a few questions today, but we have enough time. So if anyone does have any questions that they weren't able to ask during the webinar, feel free to submit them now, and we will get to as many as we can. So first up, one of our questions is, can I modify the kit costing report to add or remove columns that I would like to see?
Yeah, I can take that one. So that kit costing report is actually a primary data source that's introduced in the Custom Report Wizard. And I know for those that have attended the Sage Intacct Advantage conference, Intacct is actually going in and rewriting that Custom Report Wizard to be way different than it actually looks. But at least for now, that kit costing object is exposed in the Custom Report Wizard, and you can actually go in there and duplicate. If it were me, I would, instead of reinventing the wheel, I'd duplicate that report, and then I can add and remove any columns that I want just by selecting a drop-down, or maybe I don't want it to be grouped by the warehouse. I'd like it to be grouped by some other attribute like transaction. I can do that as well. So yes, it's exposed and it's totally editable. You can duplicate that report, Custom Report Wizard, and then go in and make any edits you'd like, and we can always help with that as well.
Thanks, Manish. And Brenda, I think that this one popped up during one of your segments, actually. What is the cost of the prepaid expense amortization, or the PEA module?
So the good news is that that module is actually already included in your core subscription to Intacct. So as long as you've got General Ledger, you've got access to that. It does need to be implemented by a partner, so you would need to call us and we will give you a quote for how many hours that would take us based on your requirements and configuration, but for the module itself there's no ongoing cost. It's just a one-time setup fee. So if you're not using it and you think that might be helpful, especially as you're getting ready for year end, it's a great way to automate that whole process so that you don't either have to do a recurring entry, and you can do it right from the AP bill screen. So it's a real benefit for those that are using it already.
Thanks, Brenda. Our next question actually has to do with regards to preview and contracts, and I believe we might have to follow up with the person who asked this question afterwards. Since it's regarding the API, we will definitely get in touch with you on that one. And then let's see.
I was just going to quickly add, Megan, when we're previewing, at least in projects or in contracts, then it just takes you to a staging area where you can then look at that, and then you can export that out in Excel or CSV. I would assume the API also has the same access and the same buttons to the same data. It's not really like running a report, but it's actually clicking a button and then getting that access real time with exactly what's tagged. So definitely a follow-up item. It's a really good question, so we can follow up with our dev resource and see if that is actually exposed in the API. High likelihood, because it's something that it's like an action that you actually click in the user interface, so we can come back to you on that.
Great, thanks, Manesh. And actually our last question today is, when are they going to force us over to the new UI? Brenda, I think you can take that one.
That's a great question, and right now the answer is early next year. They have not given us an actual date, and just like with releases and roadmap, it's going to depend on what kind of adoption they're seeing and how they're able to stabilize it for a go live. There will be, right now they're calling it a beta opt-in, where you have the option to go into the new UI, and for all the reasons I mentioned, they've rearranged the menus. There's some new functionality like the AP workbench, the new global consolidations, enhancements that will be coming out will only be available in the new UI. So the sooner you get in there, the longer you're going to have to adopt it. Granted, if you're one of those people that's not fully comfortable with technology, it is still in beta, so there are some things that are not working as well, and they are continuing to make improvements and feedback. I've sent them feedback probably half a dozen times a week, I would say, on different things that I've noted that have moved or changed or gone away that I really enjoyed, so they are listening to that.
Thanks, Brenda. And actually, another question did come in while we were answering that one, so not quite the last question. Any enhancements on inventory reporting or reorder levels?
So I think actually I had a client ask about like demand planning in Intacct's inventory module, and that is not something that Intacct can compete with like some of the other providers that do actual demand planning. So I don't believe that exists right now, but right now the theme with inventory is there's been a lot of holes and issues and clients that are upset, to be honest with you, with this module. And so Sage Intacct is going in and addressing those and fixing mostly right now around the way that cost is captured. And over the next several releases, we'll keep track of what's happening with that module. We expect significant improvements. The guy who actually kind of took on the projects module over the last few years is now moving to the inventory module, and he's one of the architects at Intacct. So we are expecting a lot of different updates in this area. Not necessarily around the reorders and the demand planning, but something that can happen because they're giving such a hyper focus on it.
Awesome, thank you. Well, that actually did wrap up our Q&A session. So first, Brenda and Manesh, thank you so much for all of the great content today. If you do have more specific questions after today's webinar, Brenda and Manesh's contact information is up on the screen. Of course, I know many of you already have personal relationships with some of the folks on the Armanino team, so you're welcome to reach out to them as well. As I mentioned earlier, we will be able to send you an on-demand recording of today's webinar as well as the slides, so no need to hurry up and copy that information down. We'll be sending it to you shortly so you can review it after the fact or share it with any colleagues who didn't make it with us live this morning. And as you exit today's webinar, there is a quick survey, so please take a moment to let us know your thoughts on how the webinar went, and we will take those into consideration for future webinars as well. So thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of your day.